Hi, class, and welcome to week 3 of Educational Psychology and Adolescent Development. Today we'll be talking mostly about cognitive development, and we'll be covering 3 important theorists, Piaget, Vygotsky, and Bronfenbrenner. Each of these theorists developed an important theory of cognitive development. We'll also be touching on literacy development as it relates to these 3 theories. Here's our vocabulary preview for the week. These are in your syllabus. And I will also remind you that this is an opportunity for you to earn extra credit by downloading the vocabulary template found in the assignments folder on the course site and completing it each week with the definition and a full sentence. You can upload this at the end of the course for up to 5 points of extra credit. Let's take a moment and think about childhood development and begin with a painting. The painting you see in front of you is a portrait of 2 children by John Badger in 1755. I'd like for you to study the painting carefully. Pause the video if you have to and write down 3 observations about the painting. I'll pause for a moment as well, and then when we begin, we'll discuss some of what you might have written down. You might have written down that the children look very adult-like. They're standing very formally. They're holding something bizarre, which is a squirrel and, I believe, a knife, which would be uncommon for children to hold. They're dressed very formally, and their faces do not look childlike at all. They look like miniature adults. The reason for this is that it was a relatively recent development that we started to think of children as being qualitatively different from adults. Prior to the 20th century, and prior to the development of a lot of cognitive learning theory, people thought of children as miniature adults. They dressed them like this. They thought they should be quiet, that they should be, quote, seen and not heard. And these beliefs were reflected in the many paintings of the time regarding children. It's only a relatively recent phenomenon, but a whole field of research has grown up that suggests that children are not just miniature adults, but very qualitatively different from adults. They think different, their bodies are different, they feel different things than adults do. And this is the body of research that we'll be talking about throughout this course, beginning today with how they're cognitively different, how they think differently. Excuse me. Which aspects of development are important for teachers to know? As we said, children are not miniature adults. They think differently and see the world than we do. And that one of the first requirements of effective teaching is that you must understand how students think and how they view the world. I remember many times in my teaching, I would pause and say, well, that's a really bizarre thing to say when a student said that. I wouldn't say it out loud, but I would think it. And it's because I wouldn't expect adults to say those things, but children are different and see the world differently, so say different things. Effective teaching strategies take into account students' ages and stages of development. So let's talk about development, and then we'll talk about what we mean by cognitive development. The term development refers to how people grow, adapt, and change over the course of their lifetimes. And so it includes personality development, social emotional development, how they develop socially or how their emotions develop. We'll be talking about this. It includes cognitive development, and that's how we develop in our thinking, and also language development. As we said, cognitive development is how children and adults develop in their thinking. We could also talk about moral development and emotional development, and we will discuss these later in the course. One of the big controversies in psychology is the nature nurture controversy. And here's the big question: is development determined at birth by heredity and biological factors, or is it affected by experience and other environmental factors? So, what do I mean by that? So, nature is your genes. More and more scientists are studying DNA and the genetic code, and they understand that a big part of who we are is determined by our genetic makeup. So you might be genetically have black hair and blue eyes, but genes also determine more than just your physical appearance. They might determine whether you get certain diseases, whether you have certain aptitudes or abilities. They might determine even sometimes interests. There's so many things that they determine now. Nurture, on the other hand, is your experiences coming into the world and growing up and then going out into the world. So, what kind of education did you have? Were you bullied or picked on as a child? Were you raised by a single mom or a single dad? Were you raised in a nurturing, loving household, or did you experience hardship growing up? These are all part of the nurture that goes into your makeup. And there's been a big debate among psychologists about which one of those, nature or nurture, has more to do with how you turn out. Researchers have studied this question, and it turns out that the answer is both are important. However, lately it's been coming down more on the side of nature being a little bit more important. The way we know this is that scientists have followed pairs of identical twins that were separated at birth. So, the identical twins, have the same DNA, the same genetic code, they look alike, but they're separated at birth and maybe go through different nurture experiences. So they have the same nature, but different nurture. And it turns out that these separated twins are remarkably similar in many ways other than just their physical appearance. They might have the same mannerisms, they often have the same interests, they often have the same levels of aptitude for things. And so when they track them down, they don't separate them on purpose, but this has just happened naturally, and they track them down. What they've discovered is that the genetic code, has been dominant even though they've gone through many different nurture experiences. Now, that could sound bleak. It could sound like, our genetic code determines who we are, but that's not strictly the case because nurture plays a large role in it too. You might have a predisposition for something like an ability to play piano, but unless someone gets you the piano lessons and nurtures you and tells you that you have talent, etc., you might not ever do anything with it. So the answer is both of these play a large role. Nature may play slightly larger role. In the earliest 20th century, there arose a very important educational developmental psychologist called John Piaget. He, not a she, he developed a biological model of intellectual development during the early 20th century. He believed that all children are born with an innate tendency to interact with and make sense of their environments. He believed that children develop schemes or patterns of thinking and dealing with objects in the world, and we use schemes to find out about the world. So, for example, think of a young baby who's just learned to sit up, and mom or dad puts him in a bathtub, and he interacts with the bath water for the first time. He might be used to pounding his fist on objects. He has a scheme for solid objects. But this might be the first time he pounds his fist into the water and encounters no resistance. And so he has to adjust that scheme that says solid objects and develop a new scheme. So some objects are solid and some are this new squishy thing that he can put his hand through. And Jean Piaget said children are always doing that. And as a matter of fact, they do it through school, and adults develop more and more sophisticated schemes of understanding the world. Out of these ideas grew a view of cognitive development as a process in which children construct their own meaning and understand reality through their experience and interactions. So, for example, the child who has constructed a new scheme for water has constructed the meaning of water. No one has taught him what water is. There are teachers who follow this idea in their classroom, and there's a whole set of thinking that of strategies that have grown out of this that are loosely classified as constructivism. And that is, we don't actually open kids' heads up and pour knowledge in. We expose them to experiences in the classroom and allow them to construct their own meaning. Teachers act as a guide on the side as opposed to a stage on the stage. If you're familiar with Montessori programs, for example, they are very much into the constructivist ideas of learning, where they expose students to certain activities and experiences and guide them through constructing their own meaning, their own learning. What you see before you are Piaget's stages of learning. Later in the module, you're going to watch some videos that depict the different stages of learning, but I'll just quickly go through them here. Sensory motor stage occurs from about birth to age 2. This is the earliest stage when babies and young children go out and explore the world. Dramatic changes occur as infants progress through this stage. Initially, all infants have inborn patterns of behavior called reflexes. So, for example, one of the reflexes is crying. All infants cry, so they're born crying. But what they learn is when they cry and mom or dad respond, then they can prompt a response with their crying. And so they begin to learn how to get things in the world. Another reflex is the sucking reflex. So when a child is born and mom puts him up to her breast, then he learns to suckle and is rewarded by the milk. Infants soon learn to use these reflexes to produce more interesting and intentional patterns of behavior. So the crying child might cry then on purpose to get mom or dad to come. As the child grows, he or she will develop object permanence later in this stage. Object permanence is the understanding that an object exists even if it's out of sight. So think of a young baby that you played peekaboo with. The reason that that's a fun game for young babies is that when you put your face behind your hands, your face goes away. They have no sense that an object can be permanent. When you go peekaboo and your face comes back, they're delighted every time because all of a sudden you're there, you're not there, and you're there, and you're not there. Later in this stage, sometime around 8 months to a year old, babies develop the understanding that the object will not disappear, that it's really there. That's called object permanence. At that time, peekaboo stops being such a fun game. The second stage is the pre-operational stage, and this is what we associate with most preschoolers and early elementary students. During the pre-operational stage, children have developed a greater ability than before to think about things and to use symbols to mentally represent objects, but they're not all the way there yet. One of Piaget's most important discoveries is that young children lack an understanding of the principle of conservation. That is, the idea that certain properties of an object remain the same regardless of changes in other properties. So, for example, when you view the video, you're going to see that A child in the preoperational stage, not understanding that the volume of water doesn't change just because you pour it from a short, squat container to a tall, thin container. They can't that they don't have that idea that the water, the amount of water doesn't change. That would be lack of conservation. Centration is the tendency to pay attention to only one aspect of an object or situation. So this is why when working with preschoolers, they have a difficult time, for example, sorting objects by shape and color. So if you give them triangles and circles and squares of different colors and say, sort all the green triangles, they might have trouble doing that. But if you said, sort them into their different shapes, green, triangle, square, circle, and then a second step, say, now sort each shape by color, that'll be much easier for them because they can only pay attention to one characteristic at a time. Reversibility, or the ability to change direction in one's thinking to return to a starting point, is also not there in preoperational stage. So if they could think this way, they could mentally reverse the process of pouring the milk or water that you're going to see and realize if it were poured back into the tall beaker, its quantity would not change. Preoperational children are also egocentric in their thinking. At this stage, they believe that everyone sees the world as they do. For example, children on one side of a display of three mountains were asked to describe how the scene looked to a doll seated on the other side. Children below the age of 6 or 7 describe the doll's viewpoint as identical to their own. So they don't have this understanding of other perspectives. Concrete operational stage operates in about ages 7 to 11. So if you're teaching adolescents, you might have some students who are still lingering in this stage. Although the differences between the mental abilities of preoperational preschoolers and concrete operational elementary school students are dramatic, concrete operational children still do not think like adults. At this stage, children develop the capacity for logical reasoning and understanding of conservation only in familiar situations. So you might have children who exhibit conservation, but only in situations where they're very comfortable and familiar. And then once you step outside of that, they can't do it. They also exhibit something called inferred reality, and that's the ability to see things in the context of other meanings, so they can take on others' perspectives now. Our text gives an example of showing a picture of a red car and covering it with black film. A child who has mastered inferred reality knows that the car is still red, even though it's covered in black, whereas a preoperational child might think that that has been changed to black. Another important test that children learn during this concrete operational stage is seriation, or arranging things in a logical progression. For example, lining up sticks from smallest to largest. Difficult for a preoperational child to do that. Transitivity also they develop, which is a skill where they can mentally arrange and compare objects. So by the end of this stage, children have the mental abilities to learn how to add, subtract, multiply, and divide, to place numbers in order by size, and to classify objects by any number of criteria. So do you see how all of these cognitive development milestones relate to when students learn addition, generally in first or second grade, when they learn multiplication, generally in third or fourth grade, multiplication and division, and then gradually throughout their school careers until they scaffold them up into higher levels of learning in middle and high school. But you might still have some students at this stage. More and more of your students will be at the formal operational stage, which takes place around the age of 11. Now, it's different for everybody, so you shouldn't think that, okay, you're 11, now you have to be in formal operational. Sometime around the onset of puberty, children's thinking begins to develop into the form that is characteristic of that of adults. The preadolescent begins to be able to think abstractly and to see possibilities beyond the here and now, and that develops into adulthood. With the formal operational stage comes the ability to deal with potential or hypothetical situations. The form is now separate from the context. So you can say to a child in this stage, what would you do if? You can put out hypothetical situations. Another ability that Piaget recognized in the young adolescent is the aptitude to reason about situations and conditions that have not been experienced, so they can take others' perspectives. So pause and reflect. What are some implications of Piaget's theory of cognitive development for educators? Well, you might consider that you have to know the development of students, and you have to be able to roughly, you're not a psychiatrist, but roughly say, okay, you're struggling with that because maybe you haven't developed this particular ability. In addition, since your students will straddle the concrete and the formal operational stages, some of those students may not have developed the ability to think and reason abstractly. And I know this is a problem. It's a huge problem with things like algebra, which is a very abstract reasoning subject. But it's even a problem in things like reading, where you're asking students to determine abstract meanings that the author intended. It's a problem in history or social studies when you're asking students to think abstractly about overarching patterns and themes in history. It's a problem in science when you're thinking about asking students to plan and conduct scientific investigations with sophisticated hypotheses. So sometimes students have to be scaffolded and promoted to the next level. Another important theory of cognitive development is Vygotsky's view of cognitive development, and he was a Russian psychologist. Unfortunately, he only lived to be 37, but in those 37 years, he developed more of a cultural view of cognitive development. His idea was sort of different than Piaget. Piaget said learning goes along in development and it just happens over time naturally. Um, and he said development has to happen and then learning happens. But Vygotsky switched that. He said, you know what? Learning can come before development, which is a change from Piaget. Let's take a specific example. If suppose parents of a baby teach it that whenever they are leaving a group of people, it is good to wave bye-bye. The baby will come to associate the hand signal that means bye-bye with people leaving. The baby has been taught a sign, so learning has occurred. So first the parents will demonstrate the sign to the baby and only do it when people are leaving. Next, there'll be a stage where the baby only does it with the parent. And then finally, the baby will learn to associate the sign with people leaving and do it on his own. So the baby has learned bye bye. And that symbol can then um, can then promote the development of learning, taking the baby to the next stages. For Vygotsky, learning involves the acquisition of signs by means of information from others and deliberate teaching. Development occurs as the child internalizes these signs, like the bye-bye, so as to be able to think and solve problems without the help of others, an ability called self-regulation. The first step in the development of self-regulation and independent thinking is learning that actions and sounds have meaning. So some important concepts in Vygotsky's theory is that one is the zone of proximal development. And this term describes tasks that a child cannot yet accomplish alone, but it could accomplish with the assistance of more competent peers or adults. So the baby doesn't understand that the sign that a waving hand means bye-bye, but the parents or the competent adults can teach the baby that until the baby is able to do it on its own. Now, the parents couldn't teach the baby to, talk and say goodbye. Why, it was a delight to meet you, right? Because that's not within the baby's zone of proximal development. The zone of proximal development, think of it as like an area of learning around the child within which they could get there. But beyond that, they're not ready to get there developmentally. So when we talk about the classroom and ZPD, and that's the abbreviation, we talk about understanding where our students are in their learning, and the ZPD is the area where we could scaffold them to get them to. I compare it to like a learning ladder. You don't take a child from the first step and put them on the last step. You take a child from the first step and move them to the second step and then the third step. Scaffolding is that assistance provided by more competent peers or adults. So when I use the word scaffold, I mean do whatever's necessary to get the child up the ladder. Cooperative learning, we've all heard that and term bandied about. Vygotsky's theory actually supports the use of cooperative learning because those competent peers can help scaffold the child to the next level. A third psychologist we're going to talk about is Yuri Bronfenbrenner. He was born in Russia but immigrated to the U.S. as a child and did most of his work in mid to late 20th century. If you've heard of Head Start or the preschool program, you probably know the work of Yuri Bronfenbrenner because he helped to start it. He developed a model called the ecological system of development. The focus of his model is on the social and institutional influences on a child's development, including families, schools, churches, and neighborhoods. Bronfenbrenner's main contribution was showing how development is influenced at each of the levels. The importance of the bioecological approach is emphasizing the interconnectedness of the many factors that influence a child's development. So here's a diagram of his ecological theory. And you see the child is at the center of the diagram. And closest to the child is the concentric ring, the green ring, closest to the child, the most influence are family, school, neighborhood, daycare center, peers, maybe doctor's office, church, synagogue, mosque. These have a lot of social influence on the child. Moving out slightly, you have other influences such as neighbors, extended family, workplace, mass media. All these are, and you can read around the blue circle, these are slightly less influential but still there. You can also see that the green circle has an impact on the blue circle. Those are two-headed arrows. So, for example, the community health and welfare services that can be offered might have an influence on the patient services delivered at the doctor's office. And finally, the macro system at the outside is a huge structure consisting of broad ideology, laws, and customs of one culture, subculture, or social class. So, for example, it's a very different experience growing up as a Muslim child in the United States than perhaps growing up with a more dominant religion in the United States. So all of these are factors that shape the child, and this was Bronfenbrenner's model. All three of these theorists, Piaget, Vygotsky, and Bronfenbrenner, can be seen to have an impact in how we think about language and literacy in secondary education. We know, for example, the development of language and literacy is influenced by the ideas. For example, students learn about 3,000 words a year. Now, they don't learn those through vocabulary exercises. Most of these they learn from conversations with others, friends and families. And this ties into the idea of Vygotsky, because remember, Vygotsky was about social learning and modeling. of more competent peers and adults. Bronfenbrenner, you can certainly see the tie-in there, those circles and who the child gets to interact with. Instead of just decoding, we know that more advanced literary and reading skills develop as the child gets older. So when they're young, they're learning how to decode words. As they get older and reading, they're learning about comprehension, vocabulary, study skills, and more. And so this ties into the ideas presented by Piaget and Vygotsky. Piaget, because Piaget believed that students went through specific developmental levels. And so he would say, you know, children aren't ready to use these advanced literary skills until they're able to think and reason abstractly at the formal operational stage. Vygotsky, once again, would say a child has to be in the ZPD, in the zone of proximal development. Whichever theory you are attracted to, we know there are certain defining characteristics of adolescent cognitive development. Your students, many are going to be entering the formal stage and may exhibit an ability to think about abstract ideas, but some are still in the concrete operational stage and not able to think abstractly. They may exhibit adolescent egocentrism. So remember how I said the very young child is egocentric? Well, they go back into that as adolescents. They come out in elementary school, but they go back. They focus on their self to the exclusion of others. The whole world revolves around them. They believe they're more unique than others. No one else has the problems they have. No one else knows what they're going through. That's because they have difficulty imagining someone else's perspective. It differs a little bit, though, from early egocentrism of the young child because an adolescent can test reality and understand what's going on. Sometimes they will exhibit fantasies that others are watching or that they have an imaginary audience. Sometimes when this takes place, it's the first step coming away from egocentrism. You might hear adolescents say, everybody's watching me. And so that might actually be a first step away from thinking there's nobody else in the world that knows me or sees me. They may also suffer from what's called the invincibility fable, that they are immune from common dangers. Unfortunately, this is why you see so many risky behaviors in adolescents. They may drink and drive, thinking that they could never be in a car accident. They may take drugs, thinking that they could never overdose. They may leap off of roofs on a dare. So that executive functioning that we're going to study later when we talk about brain science isn't fully formed the way it is later. Here's our vocabulary review. So we've covered all these words, and these are words that you're going to be responsible for later in the course on the final. And I hope everybody has a good week. One more thing, focus on certification. From this week's lesson, you should be able to apply cognitive theory in the classroom by taking into account students' developmental stages and planning appropriate lessons. You should be able to describe how to scaffold students to the next appropriate level in their learning, ZPD. So think about the EdTPA when you're doing your lesson for real and you're videoing it. Then you should be using some of these terms when you write your commentary. There's actually in our assignment later in the course, one of the rubrics has to do with tying in your lesson to theory and research. And so cognitive theory is a great place to focus your lesson. What are the students ready for? What does Piaget say they're ready for? How would you use Vygotsky's idea of ZPD and scaffolding and collaborative learning to promote learning? How would you know about your student using Bronfenbrenner's model, ecological model? So that's it for the week. Later in the module, you'll be watching some videos that depict some of these stages, and I hope you enjoy it.